So today we come to the 49th Psalm, Psalm 49, and we'll read the psalm together in a moment, and then we'll start to work through our material for today. Psalm 49. For the choir director, a psalm of the sons of Korah. Hear this, all peoples. Give ear, all inhabitants of the world, both low and high, rich and poor together. My mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart will be understanding. I will incline my ear to a proverb. I will express my riddle on the harp. Why should I fear in days of adversity, when the iniquity of my foes surrounds me, even those who trust in their wealth and boast in the abundance of their riches? No man can by any means redeem his brother, or give to God a ransom for him. For the redemption of his soul is costly, and he should cease forever. Then he should live on eternally, that he should not undergo decay. For he sees that even wise men die, the stupid and senseless alike perish, and leave their wealth to others. Their inner thought is that their houses are forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They have called their lands after their own names, but man in his pomp will not endure. He's like the beasts that perish. This is the way of those who are foolish, and of them after them, those after them who approve their words. Selah. As sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. And their form shall be for Sheol to consume, so that they have no habitation. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Selah. Do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house is increased. For when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not descend after him. Though while he lives, he congratulates himself, and though men praise you when you do well for yourself, he shall go to the generation of his fathers. They will never see the light. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. Well, let's come to the first page of our handout, and we'll talk about the setting of this. The title of our study of this psalm, that I've given to it anyway, is The Plight of Prosperous Oppressors. That is, people who oppress you, who are prospering and doing well, they have a plight, they have a problem that they don't see. As far as the setting for this psalm, it's authored by the sons of Korah. These were worship leaders instituted in the days of David. And so this could have been written in David's day. It could have been written up to 400 years later, 300 years later. The individual speaker in the psalm, where in verse 3 he talks about my mouth and my heart will have understanding, and I'm going to express this in a song. The person talking here is really more of an actor than an autobiographer. That is, this is not a psalm that grew out of one person's experience. The opening verses, there's like a soloist who's introduced to us, and he's gearing everybody up. Now I'm going to share something with you, and you listen to what I have to say. Some psalms really clearly grow out of someone's personal tragedy. A lot of the psalms of David grow out of personal experience. But in this psalm, you have a soloist who is introduced. That's your first blank. You've got a soloist who is introduced in verses 3 to 4, and he shares wisdom with the worshipers through his song. So in verse 3, my mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart will be understanding. So I'm going to share wisdom with you, and I've been listening for wise instruction, verse 4, and I'm going to put this wisdom to you now in a song, verse 4 tells us. The psalm describes wicked, wealthy people who in different ways are threatening and intimidating the righteous. Verse 5, he mentions a day of adversity, and that his enemies are kind of at his heels with sinful actions against him. So we don't know who these people might be, and frankly, throughout any time in Israel's history, you could find people like this. People who had power and used their power to extract what they wanted out of other people. Even during the height of Israel's glory, there were ungodly people in parts of the kingdom ready to take advantage of others. Even when David is king, there are people like that he sometimes sings about. And the problem was especially bad when the kings were bad. But David laments about this sort of thing even during his time on the throne. Like in Psalm 37, which is a psalm of David, is very much a similar psalm. He tells the people of Israel not to worry about evildoers when they prosper, because the Lord will eventually bring them to an end. So the number 2, the kind of psalm that this is a wisdom psalm. It's a wisdom psalm. It's intended, this is letter number 2, the genre. This is a wisdom psalm. It uses the language of wisdom and instruction like proverb and riddle and wise and fool. In fact, the opening verses sound very much like something out of the book of Proverbs. This wisdom in the poem is what would be called non-conventional wisdom. And what I mean by that is the book of Proverbs is what is generally conventional wisdom. And by that it means you do what's right and blessing will follow you. The Lord rewards the righteous, the wicked eventually come under judgment, and if you live your life wisely, there are benefits. That's conventional wisdom, and that's generally true. But there's also unconventional wisdom. That is, what about when that doesn't work? What about when godly people are suffering and the wicked are, what blank do you need me to give you? Oh, the top one was soloist. I can do it both ways. I can do it this way. That's a wisdom psalm. The non-conventional wisdom books like Job and Ecclesiastes deal with the times when, the wicked are prospering and the righteous are living wisely and it's not going well for them. There's wisdom for that too, and this is one of those wisdom teachings. So the wisdom in this poem is what we call non-conventional wisdom, because it tries to reason through the inequalities of life, just like the books of Job and Ecclesiastes.
Brother, I was thinking of David when he was king. When Saul was pursuing him and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Trusting the Lord, and he had to use wisdom.
Yes, definitely.
And trust God,
Yeah.
And, it was and each situation was different. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes, and I think that's for us to adhere to in life.
Mm-hmm.
To get taken advantage of, do we stand up, do we trust God, and especially when people are oppressed,
Well, and the wisdom that is going to be shared in this poem is pretty specific. The wisdom is about a long-term perspective. So let's go to the second panel in your handout. So Job is what goes in that last blank on the bottom of page 1. Go to the second panel. This psalm is intended not for schoolroom instruction, but for encouragement during worship. So this is not like the book of Proverbs, where the setting is a father is sitting down with his son and instructing him about the wise way to live. This is people gathered together at the temple, and this wisdom is being sung to them. So it's part of their worship, but worship includes instruction. I mean, that's a big part of our worship, is that we have times of teaching in the Word. And so here's a psalm that's written to teach people how to view the world. So the soloist, letter D, the soloist who's introduced in verses 3 to 4 teaches wisdom to the people as they listen. So this is one of those songs that's meant to be done as a solo. That seems to be how it would be sung in ancient days. All right, number 3, letter 3, the structure of this psalm. We have 4 verses of introduction, and then about 15, 16 verses of a meditation. And by meditation, I mean that he's thinking and reasoning about the problems of life that he's discussing. The opening verses introduce us to the soloist. This is the same technique, by the way, that's used in Psalm 45. If you look back at Psalm 45, before the poem really gets going, a soloist is introduced to us. Back in Psalm 45, my heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. So there, the soloist says, I'm going to sing to the king now. And this is not God, this is the king of Israel. So there's a verse there that introduces the soloist. And the same thing happens here in Psalm 49. Here we have 4 verses that introduce the soloist before the song really gets going. This is interesting. The only place in Psalm 49, the only place in the Old Testament where wisdom is said to be sung. Now, there are other wisdom psalms that would be sung, but this is the only one that explicitly says that. And the counsel that he shares is for all people in general. It's not just for the people of Israel, but notice in verse 1, he calls all the peoples, all the inhabitants of the world, and all kinds of people, low and high, rich and poor. And that's one of the features of wisdom writings in the Bible, is that they're intended for everyone. Everyone can profit from the wisdom writings of Scripture if they will set their heart to it. The main part of the poem, letter B, is the central meditation, where the problem of wicked people prospering in God's land is brought up. And the psalmist, the soloist, is going to meditate about this in 2 rounds, 2 cycles. The first half is verses 5 to 12, where he introduces us to the problem which prompted the poem, and that is the wealth, the growing wealth of wicked people. The growing wealth of wicked people. Now, in God's land, it shouldn't be that way. Oppressive people shouldn't be getting better and bigger, but sometimes they do. So that introduces us to the problem, and then the second half, verses 13 to 20, explains more about the certainty of death that faces all people, especially the wealthy who are prone to trust in themselves and their own resources. The 2 halves of the meditation have some things in common with them. Both of these halves of meditation, both of them have a refrain. What's a refrain? It's not, I'm going to refrain from eating that taco. It's like a chorus. That's right. It's like a chorus. So if you wanted to have another word in there, you could add chorus, I guess. Verse 12 and verse 20 are very similar. They talk about how all people are basically like animals who are eventually going to die. Another thing that both of these meditations have is they both encourage people not to fear. Not to fear when they see wicked people prospering and gaining power. Why should I fear, he says in verse 5. See verse 5, why should I fear in the day of adversity? And then verse 16, do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house is increased. Now, sometimes when we read these Psalms, I point out that the little word Salah tells you that that's a break point. But it's not always that, and this is another one of those examples. There are 2 times that the word Salah shows up. If you look real quick at your Bible at the end of verse 13, you see Salah. And then it shows up again at the end of verse 15, Salah. But in this psalm, these are not the places of the major divisions of the poem. Verse 13 is the beginning of a new section, not verse 14, and then verse 15 just ends a small subsection. So I want to take a moment here to talk about this little word Salah, because it does show up. It shows up, this thing shows up in the Psalms 70 times. 70 times it shows up, and it shows up a few more times in the book of Habakkuk, where Habakkuk chapter 3 is a psalm that Habakkuk wrote, and it has Salah in it several times. And I've said to you before that the exact meaning of this word is uncertain, and that's why we're basically got this Hebrew word staring at us, because how to translate it is uncertain. So let me give you 3 ideas. I think these are 3 of the best ideas about what it might mean. There is a Hebrew word salal that has some of the same letters that means to head up or to lift up. So the idea would be to lift up the voice. Maybe it's a spot here that the choir is supposed to sing something, lift up their voice. Maybe. It might mean also you're supposed to change key. We don't know. Another theory is that Salah, the letters S, L, and H, are an acronym for a Hebrew expression that means to change the voice. Or there's another acronym that could mean from the beginning, that you're supposed to repeat something. I doubt that's the case, but that's possible. My favorite theory is that this is related to, there's a Persian word, salah. Salah, which means the sound of strings. Strings.
Wow.
So it's an instrumental break.
That's my preferred take. Now, I can't be certain, but I think it's a sign that this is a place where instruments would play.
Wow.
Now, oftentimes, the natural place to do that is when you finish, let's say, a stanza. But it doesn't always do that. Sometimes it comes after a key verse in the middle of a stanza. So it's not always predictable where it shows up. So these are three theories I've listed. There's more theories, but these are three of the ones that are the most significant. But we still can't be certain, so that's why we keep just putting that word salah in our Bibles instead of picking one of these.
So the strings are an indication of victory or?
No, it's just musical instrumentation. Yeah.
Because again, I refer to David, there was string power.
Well, the word psalm means to pluck the harp.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So it's like a punctuation point. At the end you go,
It could be that. Yeah, it could be a spot where they're supposed to improvise and yes.
Strumming guitar, plus a harp or strumming guitars?
Yeah, but they didn't have guitars, but a harp or a lyre or something like that. All right, let me make some notes and applications before we go into the chart. Psalm 49 is actually a pretty complicated psalm to translate. I don't know what different versions you've got on your tables today. If you have an English Standard Version, some of the verses read a little differently. NIV, some of the verses read differently from that. It's a challenging psalm in some ways, so once you start reading it in different versions, you'll quickly see that. And yet, despite that, the overall message of the psalm is very clear in all of the versions. And one of the great lessons in this psalm is that wealth is no substitute for God's grace.
Wow.
You noted how many times it talks about the fact that these wealthy people, that in the end, that's not going to do them any good. It is impossible to barter your way out of death. When God calls us, there is no bartering with him. That's what he means in verse 7. No man can by any means redeem his brother or give to God a ransom for him. Nobody can pay someone's way out of death when God calls them. God won't take that. It's too big of a price. You could never pay that price. Having wealth is not intrinsically wicked, but it always presents a temptation for us to trust in ourselves instead of God. And nothing proves the powerlessness of that more than death, because you can't buy your way out. God's people, though, have a hope that lives beyond death. All people are subject to death. You remember that it says in verse 10 that even wise people die. Wise people die, foolish people die. Everybody dies. But God's people experience redemption when it comes to death. The wicked have no way of redeeming their lives out of God's hand, but the righteous have a confidence that God will redeem them. Look at verse 15. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Sheol here is basically talking about death, the realm of death. And I may experience death, but God is going to buy me back out of that. And this is, in other words, that's resurrection. That's new life. And we have a hope that goes beyond this life into the next one. Go to the back page, and there's a few more notes I'll share with you about this redemption price. This psalm is powerful. It says that God pays the price himself. That's the gospel, isn't it? God doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. This redemption it's more than just getting away from an early death. It reaches beyond this life. It even talks about in verse 14 that the righteous will rule in the morning. The morning means not 6 a.m. It's a metaphor for the new day, for the final day, when the kingdom comes in all its fullness. When the wicked are gone, the righteous will be the ones who will reign triumphantly. This psalm is one of those texts in the Old Testament that prepares the godly Hebrew person for what would be the unveiling of the gospel. The clearest, and the gospel is the clearest revelation of how it is that God redeems people. Jesus isn't mentioned in this psalm, but the ideas here prepare us for the fact that how is it that God is going to redeem us from himself? And the answer is through his Son, the person of his Son. His Son pays the price that we could not pay. There's a prayer by John Eaton. John Eaton is a British commentator, and he composes a prayer at the end of each of the Psalms that he writes about. And he writes here, "Inspire us, Lord, by the music of your word, that through all the darkness of death we may discern that our hope is in you alone, and know that you have ransomed our soul from the grave to dwell with you forever." Isn't that great? Before I go into the outline, I want you to see also there's 4 stanzas below. Now, this is an English paraphrase of this psalm. There are some churches who practice what's called psalmody, and this isn't in your notes, but occasionally you'll hear about this. It's common amongst some Presbyterian churches. They have psalmody, meaning they only sing psalms. And not word for word, but they sing paraphrases of the Psalms. And this is one of those. And this one is, and sometimes they're not very well done, but this one's really quite good. Now, you could almost fit this to Rock of Ages. Dust to dust, the mortal dies. It almost fits, except to get at the end of each stanza and you got to repeat a line. So it doesn't totally fit. But listen to this. I think this does a great job in summarizing the psalm. I won't sing it, I'm just going to read it. Dust to dust, the mortal dies, both the foolish and the wise. None forever can remain, each must leave his hoarded gain. Yet within their heart they say that their houses are for aye, that is, forever. That their dwelling places grand shall for generations stand. To their lands they give their name in the hope of lasting fame, but man's honor quickly flies, like the lowly beast he dies. Though such folly mark their way, men approve of what they say. Death their shepherd, they the sheep, he within his fold will keep. O'er them soon shall rule the just, all their beauty turn to dust. God my waiting soul shall save, he will raise me from the grave. Let not fear disturb your peace, though one's house and wealth increase, death shall end his fleeting day, he shall carry naught away. Though in life he wealth attained, though the praise of men he gained, he shall join those gone before, where the light shall shine no more. Crowned with honor though he be, highly gifted, strong and free, if he be not truly wise, man is like the beast that dies. That's pretty neat. That's a pretty good summary of the psalm. It's a wisdom psalm. Real wisdom comes not in wealth and getting wealth. It comes in knowing God and knowing that he is the sovereign judge who in the end will make all things right. All right, let's go to the outline that's in your chart there. So up at the top of your chart, there's a purpose statement that says, by means of a soloist sage. What's a sage?
Wise guy.
A wise man, yeah. So I use that word because it starts with an S, like soloist. So you got a wise man who's singing, is the idea. By means of a soloist sage. The psalm teaches worshipers how to process the problem of the prosperity of wicked oppressors. The soloist finds assurance in the certainty of judgment through death. Wealth can bring no redemption from death, but God will redeem his people and bless them with victorious life. So over on the upper right, this is a wisdom psalm. It's from the sons of Korah, who were instituted by David. It is sometime during the period of the Davidic dynasty, either from David's day or up till the time that the house of David falls in the 500s. So there are 3 parts to the psalm. Of course, there's a heading over on the far left. There's 2 headings. There's a note about authorization where it says, for the choir director. That means the choir director of the temple is authorized to take this song and assign musicians to it and to create music for it. And then the authorship is listed for us, again, the sons of Korah. And there are 4 verses of introduction where the songster, the soloist, is presented to us. And the first thing he does is summon all people to listen. There's a call to all the populations of the world. Notice that verse 1 is not just addressed to Israel, but all the world. Hear this, all peoples, give ear, all inhabitants of the world. Isn't that an interesting expression? Give ear. It's kind of like, make sure you're paying attention to this. And it's not only to all people of the world everywhere to learn this, but every strata of people. No one's exempt from this. Both low, verse 2, both low and high, both rich and poor together. This is wisdom that everybody needs. And then we're introduced to the soloist. The soloist is introduced to us as a sage, as a wise man. He announces he's going to give us wise instruction in verse 3. My mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart will be understanding. Interesting, the word meditation is a word that isn't just quiet reflection. It's a word for actually muttering. You never been, when you're so preoccupied with something that you sort of start talking it under your breath. Maybe it's a conversation you're worrying about, and you ever do this? You start to rehearse what you're going to say to somebody. Like, what you're doing is meditating. Now, a lot of times those practice sessions turn out to be ridiculous because the conversation almost never goes that way. But nonetheless, the meditation of my heart, that is, my mouth is bubbling out what I've been thinking about. So he announces he's going to give wise instruction there in verse 3. And in verse 4, he tells us he's going to do this by means of music. Verse 4, I will incline my ear to a proverb. That is, I'm listening to wisdom myself, and then I will express my riddle on the harp. A proverb doesn't have to mean just like one little verse. A proverb can be a whole parable. A whole poem can be a proverb. The same word is used to describe like the parables of Jesus are, they're long, many verses usually. So the rest of this psalm is the proverb. It is the teaching that he announces that he's going to give. All right, so the meditation, the main meditation of it is then verses 5 to 20. It's actually, you could say it's 2 meditations. There's a first meditation in verses 5 to 12 and a second meditation in 13 to 20. Let's just look at the first of those now. The first meditation starts off in verses 5 to 9 with counsel for the fearful heart. And he's kind of counseling himself. There's confidence in the face of prosperous oppressors. He expresses the confidence in verse 5. Why should I fear in days of adversity? When the iniquity of my foes surround me. The Hebrew text says, when the iniquity of my heels is upon me, which isn't talking about his feet doing something sinful. It means he has evildoers doing bad things, and they're right on his heels, trying to get after him. And he describes for us then in verse 6, in general terms, what's happening, that his enemies are those who trust in their wealth and boast in the abundance of their riches. There's people who think, I can do whatever I want. I can get away with whatever I want. I've got means to do it, and no one's going to stop me. If I want your land, if I want your money, if I want whatever, I can take it. That's the kind of thing he's talking about. And he says, I don't need to be afraid. Now, I may suffer some, but in the end, I don't need to be afraid because there is a God who sees all this and a God who's going to make this right. In fact, notice how he has a long-range perspective to this problem in verses 7 and 9. The long-range perspective is the certainty of death. Death is going to equalize everything. Verse 7, man's ability to redeem himself from God's final call. These rich people, they think they can do anything they want, but verse 7, no man can by any means redeem his brother or give to God a ransom for him. Now, some versions have it, instead of redeem his brother, that surely no man can redeem himself. And the idea is pretty much the same. I mean, you can't pay the price for anybody else. You can't pay the price for yourself. When God calls you, when your time is done, there's no paying him off. That's the point. You cannot pay off your day of death. Now, we don't know when our time is going to come. The Lord has appointed our days. And there's no getting around that. It's an impossible cost to redeem yourself, for human redemption from death. verses 8 and 9. For the redemption of his soul is costly, and he should cease trying forever. Or some versions will not say he should cease trying. They'll say, and he will cease forever. That is, your physical body is going to come to an end. You cannot live on eternally in this body, like just going on and on and on. You could have all the money in the world, and you're not going to keep yourself going. Eventually, verse 9 says, he shall undergo decay. So by ourselves, there's no way of paying our way around death. Death is going to equalize everybody. Everyone experiences. In fact, that's what the next verse goes on to say. Notice now, verses 10 to 12 talk about the certainty of universal death. And this is an obvious thing. It's obvious that death is going to come to everybody and dispossess everybody. Death is going to empty all of our wallets. Verse 10, for he sees, or it could be like, for one sees, anybody can see, that even wise men die. And wise here might not mean a godly kind of wise guy, but maybe someone who's clever, someone who's good with their money, someone who's made it to the top. The word wise is generic. It could be all kinds of wise people. Wise people die, take all the best efforts they can. They're going to die. And you know what? That's just like stupid and senseless people, too. We understand stupid and senseless people dying. They do dumb things. You know, you play dumb games, you win dumb awards. But all of them, regardless of how wise and smart they are and careful, or if they're just utterly foolish, they leave, verse 10, they leave their wealth to others.
You mean that cryogenics will come to nothing?
Yeah, cryogenics, this is where you freeze yourself so you can be brought back to life later on. Yeah, it's a pretty lousy resurrection alternative, isn't it? Yes.
If it worked, they would still have the same sick, old body.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're looking for one without spot or wrinkle.
Mm-hmm. Amen for that. Isn't that good? There's a real folly in assuming permanence, because that is false permanence. Verse 11. Look at the folly of assuming false permanence. Their inner thought is that their houses are forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. So they think, well, you know, look at this wealth that I've made, and man, this is a lot better than that cruddy little hut over there. This is going to. I mean, there are buildings and homes that stand the test of time in history, but they don't stand the test of death. Yeah, I mean, eventually, you're not going to live in that thing anymore. And they think that, you know, they're going to pass on their home to all generations. And look at the end of verse 11. Some people are so powerful they even name lands after themselves. And I mean, the Bible does it too. It's not like it's wrong for someone. I mean, the land of Israel is named after Israel. That's Jacob. You know, it's not utterly unbiblical. But what this is doing is attacking the pride that some people have, that they think that, well, you know, so great that my name will live on forever. But it's a false kind of permanence. And so then look at here in verse 12. Here's this refrain. It's going to be repeated in different words again. But here in verse 12, there's a refrain, a chorus about the fleetingness of these prosperous oppressors and the certainty of death. Verse 12, but man in his pomp will not endure. He is like the beasts that perish. Beasts is a word for domesticated cattle. You know, in our culture, they become hamburger. They've all got an expiration date. And there's not a thing that cow can do. Not a thing it can do. And so it is with men and people and all their glory that can't last. So this is the first meditation. The second one starts up in verses 13 to 20. It kind of circles around some of the same ideas. This one focuses even more strongly on the certainty of death of the wicked and the final vindication of the righteous. And this has two halves to it as well. The first half in verses 13 to 15 is the certainty of the judgment of death. We're introduced to the end of the foolish in verse 13, This is the way of those who are foolish, and of those after them who approve their words. Now, what he means is, I think, this is the false thinking that your stuff can somehow make you immortal. It just isn't. It isn't true. In fact, he goes on now to talk about the end of the foolish. They are like sheep led by death. As sheep, they are appointed for Sheol. So sometimes herds would be divided up amongst different shepherds. And so it's like, here's a flock of people, and they've been given over to death. Sheol, the grave. Death shall be their shepherd. Interesting, some versions read, because the word to shepherd someone is also the word to graze. So some versions read this, and the King James has, death shall feed on them, which is even more graphic, isn't it? And yet, the next phrase is a positive. The upright shall rule over them in the morning. Eventually, the righteous are going to overcome all of this oppression. There is a day coming when righteousness will rule the world and God's people will rule with King Jesus. Then it goes back to talking about the wicked in the end of verse 14. Their form shall be for Sheol to consume, so that they have no habitation. They're going to die, and their bodies will decay, and no more glory. So this is not focusing upon what happens to their souls. This is focusing on what happens to their bodies. So,
As opposed to what Jesus said about the rich man.
that's right. Yeah. So Jesus goes even further. Not only is there death, physical death, but there's also eternal punishment afterwards. So this psalm is focusing on what happens in this world, as opposed to not as much about what happens in the life to come. So even just from the perspective of this world, death is going to equalize things. But look at verse 15, God's redemption of the righteous man. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. And this seems to imply, I'm going to face death too. I might even die at the hand of these oppressors, but that's not the end for me. The Lord will bring me back to life. And in fact, in the morning, whenever that is, I'm among the righteous who will rule. By the way, the word for rule back in verse 14 is not the word for like governing. It's actually a very strong word for, it's the same word used for treading grapes, like treading the ground. It's a word for domination. The last part of the psalm is counsel, again, for the fearful heart. The meditation began with that in verse 5, and now it's going to conclude with that. Counsel for the fearful heart. There's a call to courage when oppressors prosper in verse 16. Do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house is increased, because death is going to dispossess the wicked. Verse 17, for when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not descend after him. You ever wonder where people got the adage that you never see a U-Haul following a hearse? There's the verse for it. The wicked, those who don't know the Lord or have a heavenly perspective of life, have a delusion about them. Verse 18, though while he lives, he congratulates himself, and though men praise you when you do well for yourself. In fact, some versions read it something like when he congratulates himself, and then the next verse is the congratulation. You're doing well for yourself. It's just like the rich man that Jesus has in the parable. Soul, you've laid aside many goods for many days. Sit down and have leisure. Eat, drink, and be merry. That's the self-congratulation. That's the same kind of thing. And then Jesus says, God spoke to him that night and said, you fool, this night your soul will be required of you, and then to whom shall all these things be? The darkness of death is coming, verse 19 says. He shall go to the generation of his fathers. They will never see the light. That is his you know what? He's not mindful of the fact that his ancestors have all died. None of them their wealth hasn't made them live forever. They're going to die, and he's going to go on and join them. They will not see the light. That is, death is going to be their experience. The New Testament goes further to explain to us that it's not only the first death, there's a second death where the light of God's grace is not seen. And then look, the psalm ends with a refrain again, similar to verse 12. This is more about the folly of these prosperous oppressors and the certainty of death. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beast that perished. That is, a man with glory who's not wise about eternal things is just like a dumb beast. He's going to perish. The wording, you see, verse 20 is similar to verse 12. Look back at verse 12. Man in his pomp will not endure. He's like the beast that perished. This is, man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beast that perished. The words are different a little bit, but they rhyme. The phrase in verse 12, will not endure, rhymes with without understanding. So it's kind of the same thought, expressed a little bit differently. This is wisdom. This is the wise way. The psalm is written mostly to comfort people who are being oppressed. But it's also counsel for those who would use their wealth and use other people to get wealth to see what's what. The most important thing is being wise towards God and wise towards the one who owns everything and being rightly related to him, because that is the only hope of redemption. The only way around death is God's grace. That brings light and life in the end. Father, we thank you for the time we've had this morning to look at this unique psalm. We pray that we would be instructed by it, that we would both be encouraged when we grow discouraged about the world round about us, which sometimes seems to prosper so well and they don't give a thought about God or even care for others. And also that we who live in a very prosperous nation would not find ourselves trusting in our own resources and our own ability to know that our future lies completely in your gracious hand. So teach us these things and instill this song in our heart, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.